Hi students, so now that you've learned a little bit about abiotic factors and biotic factors, we're going to use those two concepts to see how they intersect and allow species to obtain matter and energy. This is going to help you create food chains and food webs, which is the main activity you're going to be doing in the later half of this week. Please make sure you watch this video and take notes on it before your Thursday or Friday synchronous sessions. Please do this warm-up where basically you're listing the interactions that all the different species might have with each other, which would be considered biotic, or with the abiotic or non-living environment. So just go ahead and list out all of the interactions. You should pause this video. Alright, so here are some of the answers. Basically, the plants are absorbing the sunlight, the organisms are drinking and using the water or living in it. The organisms are using the oxygen in the air and releasing CO2. Here are some of the biotic interactions. The frog's going to eat the flies. The fish are eating the flies and the tadpoles. The snail's eating the plants. So these are all just a few examples, not every single one that you might see from this warm-up. Okay, so most living things can be categorized into three main areas. These are not as encompassing as three branches of life, but in every ecosystem you're going to have plants. You may have other things that function as plants. You're going to have animals and decomposers. These are the most common categories you'll see. They're all going to need matter or physical substance that makes up the universe for the same thing. And that same thing is basically to provide the materials they need for their cells to replicate or maintain themselves, okay? So it's like the building blocks of their cells. And these building blocks are known as organic molecules, or if you remember from the past unit, the macromolecules. So I'm just going to rewrite the three that we're focusing on, which are carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Now, all living things need to maintain order, or what we call this concept of homeostasis, the struggle to maintain balance. Okay, so those complex molecules that we saw earlier from last unit, they need a lot of energy to make sure they don't disintegrate. You want to make sure your cells continue to live, that they're not dying. You need to speed up chemical reactions. So you need energy to maintain order in your body. The thing is, energy is very different because it's usually massless. Okay, so it's not made out of substance, but it's basically allows you to do work if we're thinking of the physics definition of energy. Okay, most living things are going to rely upon chemical energy, which they'll get from their molecules, their macromolecules. So we're going to take a look at how this happens. We can think of this journey for obtaining energy and matter as a competition at your cell levels. They're basically competing for all of these things with other neighboring cells. But how do we get those, how do we get that matter and energy at the beginning? Well, that's a competition at the community, or how all these different species living in an ecosystem are going to get it. So they're competing with each other to get the same matter and energy. Just like when we talked about with species interaction, there is competition. Every organism's trying to minimize competition by having their own specific niches, but it is a competition to get energy and matter because these are not limitless. All these organisms have different ways of getting matter and also gaining and spending energy. And they become reliant upon each other to gain what they need. So like you can see with flowers and bees, we looked and called that an example of mutualism, right? Because both of those species are benefiting from interacting with each other. The flowers get to reproduce more, the bees are able to get more food. Sometimes you can have predation like wolves and moose, where the wolves are benefiting, they're surviving at the detriment of the moose, who are basically being killed and eaten. Okay, but these species interactions are driving the movement of water and energy in different communities. So that's why they're so important. And that's why you kind of learned about them before this. Now, for the rest of the presentation, you should take notes. And I'm going to have this particular structure, which should help you understand these different interactions. But on a piece of paper or in a Google Doc, you're going to want to have two columns. And the first column, you're going to title with how organisms gain energy and matter. And this is looking again at that community or that macro level. And then the other one you want to title with the organic molecules that organism uses, and this is at the molecular scale. Okay, so how, when you are interacting with another species, you're actually gaining some of the matter that you need. Now, the ultimate source in all ecosystems for energy is abiotic, or as we call it, non-living. Many land-based ecosystems are going to rely on the sun, and if we think back to abiotic resources, we would consider the energy the sun emits to be renewable. Now, of course, in billions of years, the sun will go out, and this will not be considered a renewable source at that point. But right now, because that's in billions of years, it's considered renewable. And basically, a lot of organisms are going to change this type of energy, okay, which is basically light or heat energy. And unfortunately, we can't use this energy to make sure our molecules don't break apart. They're going to convert it into chemical energy. So this was abiotic, and now it's going to become biotic. Not all ecosystems rely on the sun. So some are actually in areas where you have no sunlight. Okay, or there are some other sources. So, for example, this geyser over here, if you look at all these orange and red areas, those are actually bacterial mats, and these bacteria have been able to break down the chemicals that are coming up from the geyser and use the superheated water, so the energy that superheated water is emitting, to break that down. So, some ecosystems do not rely on the sun and rely on other sources of abiotic matter and energy. So how do we tap into those abiotic sources? We need to have producers, and this is why they're called producers, because they are making their own matter and energy from the non-living world, okay? If we have no producers, we would have no life. We wouldn't have any of these interactions. They're the bedrock. The most common producers we see in land-based ecosystems are plants. So what they're doing is they're taking matter from CO2 and sunlight as the energy source, and they're creating carbohydrates. We call this process photosynthesis, and that is going to be the following unit. Okay? So the producers are rearranging carbon dioxide using sunlight to make carbohydrates, which is the biotic form of chemical energy. Okay? Bacteria in hot springs are using sulfur dioxide coming from the water and the heat energy to basically rearrange this and make it into molecules that those organisms can use. Okay? You will see this also in hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, and they rely on basically the magma and the superheated water coming from those vents because they have sunlight doesn't penetrate at that, depth. So mainly producers are making carbohydrates, and basically we know this from plants that, they're using the carbohydrates to build their structures in the form of cellulose, okay? And they're really good at storing energy for immediate use. So that's typically why people's blood sugar will go up if they have a lot of glucose, because that's a carbohydrate. And producers are the main source of carbohydrates for many organisms, okay? But the main thing that they are converting that biotic and abiotic resources into are carbohydrates. Now let's go one level up. So organisms that are basically eating producers are called primary consumers, okay? And we also call them herbivores. And as you know, herbivores are organisms that eat only plants. So these producers are basically giving the carbohydrates to the primary consumers. And here are some examples. So you have cows that eat plants. You have moose that are also eating the plants. and they're known as herbivores or primary consumers. These herbivores and primary consumers are going to use the carbohydrates basically for storing energy very quickly. So, and also for building their cells. But first they have to convert those carbohydrates into some other molecules. So they take the elements that are there, and if they want to store any excess energy, they're going to store it into fat tissues. And these fat tissues are really good for the long-term storage of energy beyond a day or two. Okay? And as we already know, they're very rich in carbon and hydrogen. So here you can see a deposit of fat tissue on this little chipmunk. They're also going to take from carbohydrates and other nutrients in their food, and they're going to create proteins. And these proteins are excellent building materials for cells, because remember we talked about proteins having a really complex structure. However, proteins, because they're so complicated, they require a lot of energy to have their structures maintained. So they're not very good for storing energy. Okay, so here you can see muscle tissue, which is really complex. So for us, it's made into these fibers that have these myofibrils that make them up, that are made up of actin filaments. And you can see that the structure is really, really complex for proteins, and ultimately they need a lot of energy to be maintained. How do organisms gain energy? They gain energy by breaking down large molecules. So ultimately, you're taking the carbs that you've eaten. If we're looking at the producer and the primary consumer's relationship, you're taking those carbs and you're breaking them down into the elements that make them up, and then you are creating proteins and fats. Okay, and also you are mainly storing energy in this one molecule that's known as adenosine triphosphate, okay, or ATP. This is the main energy storing molecule, okay? It's kind of like money for your body. Any reaction you want to run is going to need ATP. Okay, so if you want to speed up a reaction, you are going to need to add ATP to that enzyme so your reaction can go forward faster. Okay, what exactly is ATP? It is made of a modified adenine base, so A base from DNA, okay? That's known as adenosine. And it's got 3 phosphate groups, okay? So these are known as a phosphate group. It has 3 of them. I'm just going to draw the P so you can see that. Basically, when you get rid of that third bond, then you're creating a huge amount of energy to run different reactions. Now, here's the kind of counterintuitive thing with chemical energy. People often think when you are breaking a bond, okay, you release energy, almost like Kool-Aid Man style, or when you are creating a bond, you are storing energy. It's actually the opposite. So whenever you're breaking a bond, that requires energy to do that. And when you create a bond, you're actually making all the elements into like a base state of energy that's really low. So you're actually releasing energy in that time. So if you're like looking at this and you're like, what? This is super confusing. What the heck is going on? Think of it as like a sum. Okay, so when we're saying we're making energy, okay, or we're gaining energy, what we're saying is that the cost of breaking carbohydrate bonds is less than making all these other things, right? So making proteins, fats, ATP, that all can do other things, that's going to, cost less than breaking carbohydrate. So it's like an investment, okay? Breaking down large molecules is like an energy investment. So just like you might put in some money into a new business, you're hoping that business expands and creates more business and more profit so that it repays for the cost that you initially invested into the company and more. So that's why we break down carbohydrates and other molecules, that we are hoping the energy that we spend to break down that molecule is going to create other reactions that will create more things for us and more energy that basically pays for the energy we took to break down the carbs. So it's a complex subject, but basically when we're saying you're gaining energy, it's an investment, okay? And you'll see this more if you study biochemistry and physics or chemistry. Okay, so how are atoms bond together? You can think of this as a review from the previous unit, but we always know that there's a certain number of bonds that we can give to certain elements. So carbon can only have 4, oxygen can only have 2, hydrogen can only have 1. Now, usually oxygen atoms are not going to bond to other oxygen atoms if they can bond to carbon or hydrogen instead. And remember, this has to do with electronegativity. So that greed for electrons. It doesn't really want to share its electrons with another oxygen. Let me just go ahead and write that down so you can remember this. So think back to electronegativity. Now, the chemical energy is stored in those bonds between the atoms. So an analogy is to think of how can energy be stored in bonds. So if you hold 2 magnets of the same ends together, there's a little bit of force between those 2 magnets, okay? And you can think or conceptualize energy being stored in those bonds as that force between 2 magnets. So some bonds like carbon-carbon or carbon-hydrogen bonds have high energy potential. That means if you break those bonds, you're going to basically create more chemicals and more reactions whose end product will give more energy than it took to break the carbon-carbon or carbon-hydrogen bond. However, some other bonds like a carbon-oxygen or an oxygen-hydrogen have low chemical energy. This again goes back to electronegativity. Okay, now let's go all the way back to ecology, which was the original topic in this particular presentation. But we cannot think of how ecosystems function without mentioning decomposers. And decomposers are really good at providing more energy and material because they break down all of those organic molecules that are left over or difficult for organisms to digest into more usable forms. So eventually they would break them all the way down to carbon dioxide or CO2, or other sugars and things that can be used by other organisms. Okay, so if we were to go all the way back, we have talked about producers that are then going to be eaten by primary consumers, and then those primary consumers are going to be eaten by secondary consumers. And the secondary consumers are going to use the primary consumers as sources of carbs, fats, and proteins. So here, this cute little fox is eating, not so cutely, this huge rat, and this owl is scoping out the snow wastelands for some other prey. Okay, secondary consumers are considered to be carnivores. They can also be considered to be omnivores in some cases. So carnivores only eat meat. Omnivores eat both meat and plants, okay? It's a cute little video we'd watch in class of carnivorous plants. Mainly we think plants are always producers, but in some cases they're in environments themselves where they're not getting enough energy from sunlight and CO2. So they're going to need to resort to some other means of getting what they need. Okay, then the tertiary and quaternary or higher level consumers are eating the secondary, or if it's a quaternary consumer, the tertiary. These are considered apex predators, so they're at the top of a food chain, okay, and they're also typically carnivores. Now, these guys have huge energy demands, so they have a lot of protein, okay, so even though they use all 3 of the other, macromolecules, they have a lot of lean muscle tissue, which mainly after water has quite a bit of protein. So that means that they need to consume a lot of prey and have prey that has protein and fats so that they can keep, maintaining this lean muscle tissue. Okay, so in the end, all the molecules and organisms form this pyramid, okay, biomass pyramid, which we'll look at more into next week. But at the bottom, you're going to have the primary producers. Then those are going to be eaten by the primary consumers. Those are going to be eaten by the secondary consumers. And finally, at the very top, you have the tertiary or the quaternary in some cases, okay, that are ultimately going to eat them all. And like we mentioned earlier, none of them could do their job without decomposers, which are basically breaking down biomass. And biomass is the sum total of all of those macromolecules put together. And they basically are giving plants the needed nutrients, and they recycle carbon and nitrogen. Okay? So in your notes, you should have these terms. You should be mentioning these particular molecules. The next slide will go over some of the answers for them, but you can look at that on your own. So I hope this was helpful to you guys. Take care.